Senate Democrats bring in a Sullivan's ban to the floor. Plus, an NBC pollster explains the huge jump in gun ownership and its political implications. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of the Reload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. This week, we are talking about a very influential, very surprising, maybe not surprising, poll from NBC News. And to discuss that, I figured we'd have somebody who could give us some real insight into this poll. And that's why we have Micah Roberts, who's he's a partner at Public Opinion Strategies, which actually conducted the poll. So it seems like a pretty good guest to have on to talk about the poll, right? Welcome to the show, Micah. Can you just tell people a little bit more about yourself and about your company?
Sure. And it's really great to be with you, Stephen. Public Opinion Strategy has been around since the 90s. We've been doing the NBC News poll since 2004. So we're longstanding partners with NBC News, as well as our Democratic partner on that, Hart Research. I also do the CNBC polling, which is another media poll that focuses mainly on economic issues, which we probably won't get to today. But I've been in this field for 16 years, all with Public Opinion Strategies. Our firm does political and public affairs work as well as these media polls. So we're steeped in research and happy to talk more about these issues with you.
Wonderful. Yes. Well, we like to have people who are experts in the field whenever we talk about these kinds of things. And so I'm glad you were able to come on and give us some insight to this poll. And speaking of which, it goes back to 1995. So we're going to get into some of the trends, which I think is another interesting bit out of this. This is actually a poll of voters. So there's a lot of political insight, which is kind of our wheelhouse here at the Reload, guns and politics. And so I think there's a lot we can go over. But the top line in this poll, really, to me at least, and I'll just see if you agree, is that it found a huge increase in gun ownership among American voters. And now, for the first time ever, a majority of American voters report having a gun in their home.
Yeah, I mean, more Americans being armed than ever before is a pretty big headline, considering the politics of gun ownership and gun rights in America. So it's the first time that's happened in our poll, going back for 20 years that we've asked the question. Over 20 years we've asked the question, and it was a 6-point increase from the last time we asked it in 2019. So the COVID years, the time after that, there's a lot of evidence to say that those years did see an increase in gun ownership, and not much public polling that picked that up. And so we were kind of not surprised, but interested that came to light in our poll. And like anything else, polls vary from one to another. There is a margin of error and everything else, but we were comfortable enough that the rise was and where it was happening definitely made sense with some of the evidence that we knew about in those COVID years and thereafter.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's the prime takeaway here from this poll. When I look at it, is it's further evidence of these trends that we have been discussing for the last 3 years. That we've seen from obviously anecdotal evidence, which is your least reliable type, right? But also from industry dealer surveys was where some of the first numbers came from for how many new gun owners we estimate came into the market during that period, which is that it's a little more scientific, but not quite the same as the poll that you guys conducted. And then we got some research from University of California, I think, looked into this question of rising gun ownership, especially among minorities and people who, women, people who haven't traditionally been associated with gun ownership in America as strongly. We'll get into some of that later, but I think the top line here is just that you found the increase, which you've seen an increase in some of the other polls. The Associated Press, for instance, their number of guns in the home is up at 46%, which was a several point increase over the pre-pandemic numbers. You haven't seen as much of an increase from, I think, some of the other surveys like Pew Research. Can you walk us through why you think there might be a difference in what you guys found versus what some of these other major media polls have found? Do you think the fact that you're looking at voters instead of adults plays any role at all? How do you break that out?
The difference between voters and adults shouldn't make too much of a difference, though. The difference could be, I mean, if you're talking about other polls have shown an increase, but they went from, say, 41 to 46 or something like that. I think that would be not a difference. I think that would reinforce the trend that we found in our poll, because it's not so much, okay, are you both getting to 52? It's over time. This is how you read polling. You look at the trend line. Is the trend line moving? Meaning, if you ask the same question the same way to the same audience, over time, is that moving the number? And so, again, I think moving any amount, 6 points, 6 points, it's important. And this one just kind of caught more attention because it was a majority. We're so fixated on a majority in our politics that this one, might have spiked a little bit. I love Pew. Pew is an extremely reputable, we work with them all the time, extremely thoughtful research organization. The difference in their methodology could be a difference in why you don't see an increase there, mainly because they have switched to and done thoughtful research to support this switch to using a panel that they've created, curated, and maintained. But those people do know that they are taking a Pew survey, and they are, typically the same people that answer those surveys. So we're getting a random sample from a voter file. Most surveys still do it that way. We do phone surveys. Lots of surveys do online. You might get some different numbers if you did this online. There's a little bit less social desirability. People might not be comfortable saying that they own a gun or have a gun in a household on the phone with somebody, and they might be more comfortable to click that box online, or vice versa. People have different, levels of personal security. But in general, I think we're going to see this number increase over time. And this was just a kind of a demarcation point that we got over 50.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that probably does play some role in why it got more attention, but I think the trend, is the bigger deal than the 50%. That is a pretty big headline for as it relates to politics, especially because it's a poll of voters. But the trend line, I think, is what you called shocking in the NBC poll. That was a 10-point increase over a decade. That
right?
Can you just elaborate on why you find that shocking? I guess.
Well,
or surprising.
It's a shock because things like this are, we all know the COVID years kind of upset the apple cart in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. Things like gun ownership are pretty, these are things that in your family you learn about, and those traditions tend to get passed down, and they're very hard to change. Mm-hmm. So for this to happen over a 10-year period, we know the reality of our, societal differences that may have impacted that. And I'm not saying that I know exactly why it's 10% difference, but you can look across the last 10 years to 2013, and there's just more unrest. There's more division. And I think people feel more unsafe, and they have felt more unsafe even in the most recent years since COVID, whether that be, January 6th for people on the left, or the summer of 2020 riots and BLM on the right. I think there are lots of reasons people feel less safe. Part of that also being, the justice system having significant reforms in the Trump years, and those becoming kind of coming to fruition in communities. But again, that's that's a lot outside of the poll findings. That's a lot.
Yeah. You're just saying that it's kind of a perfect storm. Kind of a perfect storm of motivations for all sorts of different people to go out and buy guns in 2020. Right. But it sounds to me like you mean like to have that sort of shift in something as polarizing, I guess, as gun ownership in the United States on a like societal scale, where you're seeing, right. I mean, 10 points in a country of 350 million people. That's a lot of people buying guns, right? For the first who hadn't previously owned them.
Yeah.
And that's the shocking thing, right? Is this change. You don't see that happen in such a quick period, I guess is what you're getting at, right?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. And it's pretty steady, meaning we saw a pretty steady rise from the 2024 to, 2004. So I'm going back 20 years now. 2004 to 2023, pretty steady rise among Republicans, about 9% increase. Among independents, it kind of bumped around, but it's in the mid 40s. And then the other kind of main finding here is that after 20 years in the mid 30s of Democrats saying that they have a gun in the household, this one poll had 41% of Democrats saying that they have a gun in the household. So that's where a lot of the increase is coming from since 2019.
Right. Yeah. Huge increase among Democrats. And not, I do obviously want to put the caveats, as you mentioned earlier, that this is a single poll.
Yes.
So, not everybody can just draw concrete conclusions out of a single poll, but it is, I think, a well done poll that has a history to it. And you have these trends that you can look at and there's still takeaways you can have that are based in, in reality and not just guessing, I guess, or little firmer evidence here. But and
also we're doing this poll the same way every month for 20 years. I mean, obviously our methodology changes some to keep up with things like cell phones or whatever. But this is a very solid piece of research that is done very, very meticulously. And
right. So it's just one poll.
It matters.
It's just one poll, but it's apples to apples comparisons that we're doing inside of this one poll. Okay. That huge increase among Democrats also is interesting for another reason, which is the demographic drive of that. You're seeing, I think it was a 17-point increase in African Americans who obviously tend to self-identify as Democrats much more often. 17% increase from just 2019 in gun ownership among that group, right?
Correct. Yeah, they went from 24% to 41%. And sometimes, again, subgroups can change. When you have the Black voter population is very homogenous, meaning from poll to poll to poll, they're a very, very good group to gauge, is something changing or are things, because they don't change that much. They're very reliable, I guess is the best way to put it. So like their politics are very reliable. Their economic attitudes are very reliable. These types of demographics are very reliable. They're 12 or 13% of our sample. But they're a very reliable group to look at trends among. And so this group, that change was, again, that was just an important finding. And then the other part of it was where some of these increases happened. So we like to look at the country based in broken out into different county types. And so we look at core urban counties. Those are the counties where like the 25 biggest cities exist. Then we look at the urban ring, which are the little counties, not little, but the counties that are around those large urban centers. And then we have a large swath of the country that's the outer burbs. So that's like 40% of the population lives in that place. And they are the places between the rural and the urban ring. And then you have the rural areas. This growth in gun ownership is happening not in the urban core. So while it's happening among African Americans and Democrats who index higher in the urban core, those people groups are not the people that are owning guns are outside the urban core. So it's African American and Democrats in urban ring, outer burbs, and where they exist in rural areas. Although rural areas are much wider and much more Republican.
Interesting.
But we still saw increases from 2019, because this isn't like isolated to Democrats and African Americans. In rural communities, in rural counties, the percent of gun ownership went from 62%, meaning 6 in 10 rural households have a gun, to 73. So they're increasing as well. Outer suburbs went from 52 to 59, so another 7-point increase. And then the urban ring went from 32 to 40, so an 8-point increase. But in the urban core, those big city counties, it only went from 37 to 40, which is really margin of error. I mean,
right.
And a lot of it is in that margin, but it's notable that the groups with the largest increase are not the places where they're increasing are not like where you consider them to index the highest, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. So it's more Black Americans in the suburbs than it is Black Americans in the cities themselves.
And the way that impacts, or
I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, no, I was just going to say, and obviously it's not just them. One of the really interesting things that you made, the point that you made there at the end was these are where you're seeing the largest increases, which is fascinating. But also, you're still seeing increases in places where people already own guns at really high rates. So it's sort of an across the board thing. I guess it goes back to that perfect storm analogy earlier. Like everybody had a pretty good reason to go out and buy a gun, and they might have been very different reasons or even conflicting reasons. And so that really drove this up. But it had the biggest percentage effect, I guess, among certain, these particular demographics you're talking about here. Minorities living in, the collar counties around Philadelphia or something like that. Right. It sounds like what you're talking about.
Exactly what I'm talking about. Yes. I would just add one other point, how this translates politically is this isn't the only place where you see like, Black suburban, Hispanic suburban, especially men, you see them moderating or shifting. They have much lower ratings for Biden. They're much more conflicted about the Democratic Party now than they ever have been. And that really came in the era of Trump, where, he, for good or ill, and no matter how you feel about it, he performed better in 2022. Republicans performed better among especially Hispanic men, but also with Black men. And it's marginal, but those margins make a difference when you're talking about, a national election or even a statewide election that's won by the scantest of margins, 2 or 1 point, or even, fractional points.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into that.
Like Florida, it's not just Trump. Like DeSantis won Miami-Dade County. I mean, that hasn't happened, I don't know if ever, for a Republican, but certainly not in the modern era. And he won the state by like 22 points, which is unheard of. So and translates or piggybacks on the political shifting that's happening.
Right. That makes sense. And it could be one of the things driving it too, but that's where I want to go to next here, because one of the other really great things about this poll is how much it dives into the politics of these gun owners, because this sort of I don't know, maybe a unified theory about the surge in gun ownership that exists in pro-gun circles now, where millions of people became gun owners for the first time. Gun owners tend to vote more pro-gun than non-gun owners. To put it in extremely simple terms, they tend to dislike more gun restrictions. They tend to prefer looser gun laws than people who don't have a gun in the home. And that is also something you find in this survey itself. So the idea goes, plus all these new gun owners are from these demographics that traditionally, at least on the demographic level, not necessarily individually, obviously, but we're talking about big groups of people, they tend to vote more Democratic. And so some people, I think, had the idea that this was going to, turn people overnight into party line Republican voters, because that's the ostensibly pro-gun party in our two-party system. There's very big contrast on policy, certainly between the two parties when it comes to guns at this point, and it's pretty stark, and everybody knows it. That obviously hasn't happened to a certain extent. Obviously you didn't have all these new gun owners immediately become reliable Republican voters, but perhaps I've always thought, at least, that what makes more sense is over time you'll see some of these new gun owners change their position on guns, at least, and that could have an effect at the very least in Democratic circles,
Sure.
Where there's some more moderation, because the party itself has moved really to the left on the issue over the last decade or so, and I don't know that we've seen that effect yet, and these numbers in here might explain why. So can you, one of the things that I notice when I look at it, and I want to get your understanding of this, it sure seems like Democrats are driving for the most part, this huge increase in gun ownership among voters. But at the same time, they're actually becoming more. It's when you ask them the question of whether they're more concerned about the government going too far with gun regulation or not going far enough, they've actually moved. Democrats as a whole, as they've become more likely to own guns, are actually more concerned that the government will be too loose in their gun restrictions. Yeah. Is that an accurate reading of this poll?
Yeah. So, there's two things that really drive opinion on gun rights. One is having a gun in the household, and two is your political affiliation. And when we combine those two things and we look at Democrats who have a gun in the household or Republicans who have a gun in the household, it doesn't override their politics, meaning they will vote their partisan leaning over whether or not they have a gun in their household. So it continues. Another way to think about it is partisanship continues to divide gun owners on gun ownership as much as it does non-gun owners on gun ownership. It doesn't, putting a gun in a responsible American's hand does not make them a Republican. Look,
but it also doesn't even seem to necessarily totally change their mind on the core question. As long as I guess we are talking about people who are self-identifying with one party or another. So if you consider yourself strongly enough to say to a pollster that you are a Democrat, the fact that you own a gun doesn't necessarily change your concept of the policy implications.
Right. And I think if you think of that through, if they were able to obtain a gun, then what, do they believe that the government's being too harsh about gun ownership? Right. They could say, well, I got one. It wasn't that hard. It was adequately hard if you live in a state like California or something like that. Like, it was hard enough that I feel good about the level. And I don't want it to be looser than that. So you can come at it from both ways. When I purchased firearms for myself, I'd purchased one on a weekend, and I had to wait until after a waiting period, and I thought that was a little bit stupid. But that's me as a Republican, in my personal opinion. I would say from the poll, the other thing that we need to keep in mind is there's very few people that make political decisions based just on the gun issue. It's like 9% on that in our poll. About 9% of people tell us that gun rights or gun restrictions are the most important thing about their vote. Meaning, if they would vote for or against the candidate, regardless of party, based on that point of view. So compare that to other issues like protecting democracy and constitutional rights. That's like 19% of the population say that, that's the most important thing to them. And another large issue like and divisive issue like abortion, that's 18% of the country or of voters. And again, and another one that's above guns is immigration and border security. So there's lots of different things people weigh in their politics, and guns not the top thing.
Yeah, guns, and you see this a lot in polling. Guns tend to be maybe a second level issue, I guess, or in the middle.
Yeah,
they're not usually at the very bottom when it comes to voter motivation or your single most important issue questions in a lot of public polling.
sure.
But they're not usually the number one issue. Sometimes they'll, it depends on what the public's focused on, I guess, at any given moment. Sometimes they shoot up a little bit higher.
Sure.
Although usually that tends to be after mass shootings.
Yes.
I would say. So,
yes.
Although it could be also I imagine if there was, for instance, a major gun ban was signed into law, the number might shoot up because of that as well.
Not to take us on a tangent, but when the abortion law was signed, it used to be not the law. Sorry, when the abortion decision
Supreme Court case.
It used to be that the single issue abortion voter was a deep red Republican. But the next survey, I mean, that was for 20 years. That if you're a single issue, you were voting Republican, conservative, Fox News watching. It was deep. Mm-hmm. But as soon as the Dobbs decision came, in the very next survey we did, the single issue, the same question, the single issue abortion voters said, "Yep, that's the issue that I'll vote for based on that issue, nothing else." They were liberal blue, college educated women, which is, not the Republican base. So it was crazy. I mean, but they can change like that when laws change or something dramatic happens.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's
huge finding in a poll in 2022 that we did for NBC as well.
In fact, I kind of wonder if, the Supreme Court ruling that came out alongside Dobbs in Bruin, the major gun case that they did, which really expands the courts recognized Second Amendment protections, at least, because people will debate what the Second Amendment protects and what doesn't. Supreme Court said now explicitly that it protects gun carry, and you do wonder if that has a deflating effect on gun rights activism. Right, how much people put that at the top of their list if they think it's what they want is secured by this ruling, they may not have it as much of a priority in their voting, list.
Yeah,
that's speculation.
In 16 years of doing this, and especially in this time period between basically the Obama era, or the late Bush, early Obama era is when I started doing polling. Is angry people vote, people vote. And so when the abortion rights come under attack, and that's how the people see it, who got very active or very fired up about it, when they feel like their rights are under attack, they're going to go out and get active. So that happened in 2022. That happened in a large part in some of these little, I don't know if you follow this very closely, but some of these little elections, Ohio had an election about abortion rights and kind
special elections and ballot
special elections. I mean, people are fired up. And so I think you're right, though, if you expand it sounds like, I haven't followed it very closely, but it sounds like the Supreme Court said that constitutional carry is basically protected.
Gun carry, public gun carry, they struck down New York's law. In effect, they also changed the test for how to determine if a gun law is constitutional. And so you're seeing a lot of gun laws come under question, the current laws at the federal and state level. So, it's had a big effect, and maybe that plays into how people perceive the issue as well. You can, I think what you're saying is just like a pretty good view of how politics works generally. Like people, the reason that a person's single most important issue changes all the time is because the perception of what's being attacked or not changes all the time as well, based on what happens in life, right? So that certainly makes a lot of sense. And that may be one of the things about having a stalemated gun debate in the United States is it probably pushes the importance of the issue a little bit further down for most people, because they either they don't expect things are going to change one way or the other, and whether they're like that or don't like that is another question, but they still have that ultimate conclusion, and it might drive down what they think matters to their vote.
The narrative definitely, the narrative, especially from this poll, where we talked about government going too far or not far enough, that we are stalemated. We are basically split even as a country around those issues.
Yeah.
And that can get kind of like, could be a bit of a slog when you have to fight, and nobody's changing their position. When we see polling that's like, well, actually, 75% of people support banning firearms. You see that stuff from time to time, and it's usually because people aren't actually digging into the question, or they're using terminology that's confusing or misleading.
Right.
So, like,
and you see that sometimes in actual ballot initiatives too. The universal background checks always rates really highly,
right,
in polling, probably because a lot of people don't understand how the background check system works, and they just like background checks as a concept. But in practice, when Maine tried to do it as a ballot initiative, it failed, even though every national poll will put it at 80 to 90% support.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a good point. One thing I want to go back to, though, I guess in this idea of that we're split is, when I look at these numbers and I look at the trend here for the question on whether the government is going too far or not far enough with gun regulation, what I really notice is less of a change. There wasn't much of a change between when you did that poll in 2019 and this year, despite this huge increase in gun ownership. There's a 4-point change. Now it's almost exactly even, when before there was a 5-point advantage to concerns the government wasn't going to do enough to restrict firearms. But, even that's not a wild change from 2015. Either, there was an 8-point swing there was concerns were that the government would go too far, won by 8 points in that one. That's all within, 8-10 points. The real swing is from the 90s, what it looks like to me, where there was a 23-point agreement that the concern was that government wasn't doing enough. And really, it seems like most of that swing from 23 points to the idea that the government's not doing enough to more or less even today, a 1-point, I think, advantage for not doing enough. That's really driven by Republicans have changed the most. Looking at this, that they were +3 on the idea that the government wasn't doing enough in 95, and now they're +70 on the concern that they're going to do too much.
Yeah.
That's much bigger than any of the other changes.
It's fairly animating, I guess, for Republicans as an issue.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard to really make it's hard to make comparisons back to 1995. We're coming up on that being 30 years ago, and a lot of things do change. I mean, we had kind of the beginning of the spate of school shootings, mass school shootings in 99, starting about 99 with Columbine. Yeah. You had 9/11, which, changed our security mindset.
Crime rate was much higher back in the 90s too.
What's that?
The crime rate was much higher in the 90s than it is today. Although that was one of the things that was different about 2020 and 2021 as well, is that the murder rate went way up from where it had been.
Yeah.
Another reason that people probably went and bought guns. But the one thing, and obviously today you see Democrats and Republicans are almost the exact opposite. They're basically mirrors of each other on that question. It's a 70% difference for Republicans who are worried the government will go too far, and it's a 71% difference for Democrats who are worried the government won't do enough, which is remarkable. And then independents sit right in the middle of that at almost even, which is just a fascinating little demonstration of polarization in the United States, I guess. But the last thing I want to ask you real quick is, I know looking at this, there's good reason to maybe discount the idea that the rise in gun ownership is going to have a political effect at all, but there is some, obviously, it's not nearly as stark of a contrast between just generic gun owning households and non-gun owning households, but there is some difference between, Democratic non-gun owning households and Democratic gun owning households. It's about 8 points difference in how they view the issue. And same thing for Republicans, almost exactly the same thing for Republicans. So, it still seems plausible that over time, perhaps you're going to maybe see an effect on gun politics in either party push more towards gun owners and people who don't want to see as many restrictions. Do you think that's still a viable theory looking at this, or are those numbers just too small?
Well, because you got 41% of Democrats now saying that they have a gun in the household. It's not a small chunk of their party. I think the near term impact that can have is that maybe some of the concerns around guns or the more restrictive policies get watered down, and maybe the rhetoric gets a little bit toned down. As inter-party, they're having a conversation that has more voices that could be supportive of gun ownership. I mean, the fringe on either side, I think will always exist. And the fringe on the left saying that, like, no guns, get rid of them all. I think, I don't know that they have a lot of power, but maybe those efforts and the efforts in state legislatures and will have a little bit less punch in them because there's a growing sense of, well, gun ownership's okay for me. Why isn't it okay for others? The partisanship, though, just going back to your point about, the polar opposite kind of opinion among Republicans versus Democrats on this issue, that chart that you looked at is probably like almost every chart that I see bipartisanship when it comes to any issue of importance in America. We are so deeply divided by partisanship. It is almost a surprise when things aren't that deeply divided, when we find something we actually agree with. But most of the stuff we agree with are pretty negative, like that we're in decline, or the next generation is not going to be as great as the last, or that things are headed in the wrong direction. So, not to leave you in a bummer position, Stephen, but
well, I mean, that's reality, right? Unfortunately, it's what the polling shows. I guess we shouldn't be terribly surprised, but yeah, that is depressing to some degree. I do still think that while the contrast, it is interesting that the contrast between just gun owners and non-gun owners, when you ignore the partisan angle, is pretty stark. It's what, how many points is that? Probably
60.
Yeah.
60 point spread.
Right. Yeah. Pretty huge. I think, it's exactly 60.
Right.
And then the gap between, when you add in the partisanship, it's only like 8 points. That does speak a lot about how much people are more dedicated to the party they're in than they are to, their guns, I guess, one way or the other. But I do think that does still show you some room where there is potential for movement towards, I guess, or away from stricter gun control policies. Overall, that's what I expect from that's what you'd expect, just seeing more people owning guns. I guess the takeaway is maybe don't count on that effect as much as you might think.
Yeah, I think it's a long-term. I think it may be a long-term play. I wouldn't expect it on a short term. Maybe, like I said, it's a softening of position. But again, politics are, entrenched interests and very people. Let's be frank. People make a lot of money on both sides of the gun issue, on both sides of the abortion issue, on both sides of almost any issue out there. People are out there, advocating and creating, material and everything else. There's a lot at stake, more than just the political positions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. It's a whole industry affected as well, and then and the byproducts of that too. So, look, I appreciate you coming on and walking us through this poll, because I really think that the top lines are super important, but also the details in this were really interesting and speak to a lot of the stuff I think we've been looking at in gun politics over the last 3 years. Trying to it's good to have more evidence one way or the other on these things, and this evidence is pretty fascinating. The way it all breaks down. Way more guns, but and most of that's coming from Democrats, but they're not really changing their mind about guns. In fact, they seem to be getting more supportive of the idea of restrictions. So that's pretty interesting and odd. Not what you'd expect, not the sort of the stereotypical outcome, but yeah. And then you dig in a little bit deeper, and I think there's even more to unpack. So I really appreciate you spending some time going over with us about this, because you're one of the people who did the poll, and so who better to do that with.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciated talking to you. And next time we'll ask the question, I'll come back on and share what happens next. Yeah,
that sounds great. I really appreciate it. And if people want to follow your guys' work, how can they do that? Where can they find your polling?
Twitter, X. You can follow at Micah Rob, MICAHCROB, and our company's Twitter handle, X handle, is PO Strategies, I believe. So it's POS Strategies. So give us a follow. It's we don't just talk about guns. Obviously, we talk about lots of polling data, and we usually have pretty interesting stuff. So love to get some more followers. Yeah.
And a lot of your work is published by NBC and CNBC.
We do the polling for them. Yeah, but the majority of our work is for candidates, associations, businesses, and groups that do polling on their issues as well. So the media side is fantastic, but it's just a small portion of the work that we get to do.
All right, wonderful. Well, yeah, we'll definitely have to have you back on once you guys do another poll like this. And yeah, we're going to head over to our news update now. Thanks.
All right. Thanks a lot.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are we doing this week, Steve?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing, Jake?
Doing pretty good. Can't complain.
Good. I guess we never have a bad week, because we're always doing pretty good.
That's what we're here for, to bring positivity to our listeners.
Earlier in the week, was not doing as well, thanks to the Eagles getting crushed.
Oh,
that was not fun to watch. But the Flyers are shockingly good for some reason, second in the Metro Division. So all my emotions rest on the outcome of Philly sports games, and you really just swerve from cocky to depressed all the time when you're a Philly sports fan. So it really depends on the day and what game just happened. But right now, because the Flyers won last night, feeling all right.
Things are good, yeah.
Do you have anything fun planned for this weekend? Any maybe the range or going somewhere or anything like that?
I actually am trying to put together a trip to the range this weekend. A couple of buddies of mine that I usually shoot with, we haven't gone in a while. So we want to go check out this new range. This kind of fancy new range opened up about 20 minutes from my apartment. It's a nice indoor range, but it has a restaurant attached to it. So after you shoot, you can go sit down. And I think there's either a brewery or a distillery attached to the restaurant, so you can shoot. And once you're done shooting, you can go have a nice meal and drink craft brew beer. And so thinking about checking that out.
Yeah, that seems to be the trend in the industry. we just got a new super high end fancy range that they call these. They used to call these things years ago country clubs, right? I don't even know that that's really the right term for it. It's more like fast casual version of a gun range, if that makes sense. Like if you're just trashy indoor range that goes out to 15 yards and doesn't have heating or air conditioning is your normal fast food version. A lot of these new ranges, it's like they're not 5-star restaurant style things, most of them, but they're like nice. You know what I mean?
Right.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, that's sort of the vibe I'm getting from this place too, is where it's like, yeah, it's nice. It's just compared to what, right?
I mean, it's not a country club in the sense that it's not going to cost you $20,000 to join, right? But it might cost you. It's certainly going to cost a little more, and it's going to have a lot more to do. Like they want you to not just shoot there, but also like the place by me in Loudoun County, Virginia. It's called XCal. Super nice, brand new facility. It's got a gym attached to it. It's got a like a food court area and a nice big not just gun store but also merchandise area. So like you go there for more than just to shoot 100, 200 rounds at the range in an hour. Like you're supposed to, it's like a destination now. And I've noticed that in a lot of newer ranges that I've been to around the country. One just opened up by the farm in Pennsylvania. It's called Mainline Armory in Fraser, Pennsylvania. That's similar idea, just really very high end range. Doesn't have a gym, but it does have like a very upscale gun store attached to it with merchandising and yeah. So it's just I don't know. It seems like the market for ranges has really moved up over the last 10, even just 5 years, because all these ranges that we're talking about are from the last couple of years.
Yeah. It is interesting capturing a new market share of new gun owners that maybe want different kind of range experience. So interesting.
Yeah. A little more upscale experience. That seems to be the trend. Because I haven't seen any bargain basement ranges open around anywhere near where I live. So I don't know. Maybe that's just based on where I particularly go. But I mean, I also saw this when I was out in Pittsburgh speaking at Carnegie Mellon University a couple of years ago. They had a super high end range there, Keystone range, I believe it's called. Same idea. So I like it. You know what I mean? Like it's nice. These ranges are like, you want to go in there. It's not just, it is what it is. And if I want to shoot, I got to go where, bear out the heat. Even the place that by me that wasn't nicer has now upgraded itself to have heating and air conditioning in the range I think just to keep up with these other places. So, I mean, good. These positive movements in the industry, I would say.
I'll like it until they start charging me $40 to reserve a lane for an hour or something. That's where you get diminishing value. But
that's true.
So far,
it really
so good.
Depends on how much they're charging for this upgraded experience. But although I don't think it's been, in my experience, the prices haven't been crazy.
Yeah.
Like I think they do like a tiered membership stuff a lot of these places. So if you want the highest end experience, it's probably pretty expensive. But I still think they keep it relatively reasonable for just you want to go in and shoot for an hour. So I think this positive movement. It speaks maybe to where the customer base is at now, at least in the sort of suburban, exurban areas where we are, right?
Right.
Either way, of course, in the rural areas, you could just go out and shoot. To go to a range, which frankly, I'd prefer that if I could. You just have a nice range on your own property. That's the dream right there. But anyway, I do have an update on my gear. Have you gotten any new guns or anything?
Yeah, no new firearm purchases lately. Yeah, nothing exciting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I haven't gotten any new guns, although there's lots that I want.
I'll say there's plenty that I want. I can tell you that,
as always. But I have been, we've talked about my concealed carry situation before on the show a bunch of times, and I figured might as well give an update because I have changed up things a little bit, and I'm probably going to change a little more in the near future here. I'm not a gun reviewer, right? I'm a political reporter guy, but I do carry every day wherever I can. And so I figure this is helpful to just normal people who want to hear about the experience. But so I had the Pollster Enigma, which I really enjoyed for, especially for someone my body shape, which is not male model body shape, if that, to put it lightly. But, I never really carried appendix before I got that holster system, and I do like it. But, in the end of the day, appendix carry, I think overall is still going to be a harder thing to pull off than strong side with a normal outfit, even with the best system. And so I still honestly prefer strong side carry, but I want to have, that ideal Goldilocks holster that does all the things you need a holster to do, like cover your trigger guard and secure your firearm well, but also be really comfortable. So there's hybrids get a lot of, they don't do a lot. Most hybrids don't do most of those things. They do the comfort thing. They don't do the other stuff very well. And so I actually ended up buying the, this is called the Black Arch Protus, I believe. This was actually the one like hybrid holster that Active Self Protection recommends, because John Correa has a very low opinion of hybrid holsters for the reasons mentioned earlier there. But they do recommend this one because it's a bit special. It has a sort of 3/4 Kydex shell on it, so that when you put the gun in the holster, it actually clicks in and fully covers the trigger. So, it's not going anywhere. It stays in there. And, but it's still nice, like suede backing and very comfortable to carry. So I've enjoyed that. It's basically replaced I had that Alien gear that didn't actually fit properly over the optic on the factory optic on this 6 hour P365 X macro. But I like this one a lot better than the Alien gear. And so that's what I've been carrying, and it's worked out really well for me so far. Also, if you remember, I had issues with these magazines, right? That was the whole point of buying the X macro for me, was that I could get the 17 rounds, because, you watch those Active Self Protection videos. And if you don't watch Active Self Protection and you carry, you really should. You should listen to the podcast. I do the news update for them, if you don't know that already. But the main part of the podcast is self-defense stories and interviews with people who are involved in a lot of the videos that the YouTube channel shows. So super high quality content, in my opinion, and really useful for anybody who either is a cop or a concealed carrier, or really just interested in self-defense generally. They don't just talk about incidents that involve firearms. So a lot of really good information over there. But one of the things they show, they have this great compilation they have their own app that's has a monthly membership as well over there, but they have these compilations of like key points that they make from watching all these videos of self-defense incidents. And one of them is like, how much capacity do you really need? And the point of the video, using actual real world incidents that you watch, right, is that you kind of can't have enough capacity. Some of these sometimes, and we've talked about this on the show when we've done these gun surveys. Like we had Professor William English from George Washington University in his survey, and most self-defense incidents, most gun defensive use incidents require 0 shots to be fired, right? And then the percentage gets smaller and smaller as many shots go up from there. And so it's not that you're very likely to run into a situation where you need 17, 18 rounds, but it certainly happens. That's the other thing. Like, it does happen. And so that's my logic for why I want to carry a lot of rounds, but also I want to be able to wear my normal outfits, normal clothes. And so I want a gun that's pretty concealable. And that was the beauty of the X macro. But if you remember when I got it and I got these magazines, the springs were so tight on these that when I loaded them full to 17 and then tried to rack around into the slide, you could do it, but it was real hard. And it made me worried that, when I'm carrying 17 plus one in the chamber, and I fire that first round, maybe that second round isn't going to actually strip off and go into the gun correctly. And I'm going to have, a misfeed on the second round, which is probably one of the, other than the first round not going off, that's the worst thing that could happen.
Yeah,
right?
No doubt.
If you're actually having to shoot at somebody, that means you're in a deadly force scenario where your life is at risk, and your gun stops working. It's hard to imagine a scarier thing. But anyway, the good news is that, plus, like, at that point, I was like, well, all right, I could load it to 16, but then why did I buy this guy? I could have gotten a P365 XL, which is 15 rounds and smaller than this, and much less money too at the time. And so I was just kind of annoyed. Like, the 17 is the whole selling point of this thing. But luckily they have broken in. You just need to keep 17 rounds in there for a while, and eventually it loosens up enough to where you don't have that same issue anymore. So I'm happy to report that. And yeah, I mean, that's the update. Also, the optic. I replaced the battery, last time, I think, when I had to go up to the farm for the murder situation. And it stayed alive. I was at this point, I'm kind of wondering if maybe it was the crappy batteries that it was shipped with, and I put a cheap battery in there too. So could have been partially my fault on that front. I don't know. It's hard to say. I'll have to keep carrying it and see how long the battery lasts. It's only been a couple months since I put it in there, so it's unclear to me yet if it was a battery issue or if it's the optic itself is just chewing through batteries way too fast. I've asked for an optic for Christmas, so I don't think I'm going to stick with this SIG Romeo Elite, or what, Romeo Zero Elite, I think this one's called. I just think, honestly, I don't know. Have you looked at the optic market lately?
A little bit here and there. I know we were talking a little bit before we recorded just about all the crazy new offerings that are just flooding the market just because of how popular they are now. But I haven't followed it too closely just because I've been pretty happy with the one that I have. I only have one pistol that's drilled and tapped for an optic. So
what do you have again?
It's a Holosun SRS. So it's one of the Holosun ones, and it's made to go. You don't have to do like a base plate. It just integrates directly into the footprint of a Glock MOS slide. So, and I've been pretty happy with that so far.
Yeah, I don't want a foot plate. I don't want one of those plates either, adapter plates. I think that this is what's like a Shield RMS cut on these SIGs, I think. So they make tons of optics for that. Thankfully, there's like the RMR cut and then the RMS C cut, I think it's called. That's because the industry has kind of standardized from the last couple of years, and it's really matured the offerings. Because I remember thinking like a couple of years ago, and even talking about it at least on Twitter, like these. I had the same view of suppressors and red dots a couple of years ago, where it was like, why are these so expensive? Suppressors, I guess you could at least say a suppressor is literally just a metal tube with baffles in it. It's the same exact thing as your muffler, except small enough to fit on a gun, right? So why are they so expensive for what they actually are? There's no moving parts or anything, right? I think part of that is just because they're regulated by the NFA, and so that keeps demand lower than it otherwise would be. And if you had higher demand, maybe you would, benefit from some of that scaling of production, and you get lower prices, is what I guess. So that they kind of have to keep prices a little higher to keep their profit margins, thick enough to make sense. That's part of what I'm guessing. I'm sure maybe we can have someone on the show to do a whole episode on suppressors. That might be a good idea. But So that's one explanation. Red dots, I mean, it's a laser that points at a piece of glass. And they were, a couple of years ago, you couldn't find anything that wasn't cheap garbage for less than like $500 or $600. Now you still find red dots at that price point, Triticons and some of the other high end dots that do have really good reputations. But a couple of years ago, you couldn't find anything less than like $400 that was any good. Now, I mean, the market's kind of flooded with what seem to be really solid low end options. I think Sealy is a brand, is Chinese. There's a lot of these Chinese brands, and it's one thing. A lot of them are made in China, outside of like Triticon or some of the SIGs, I think. But at this point, there seem to be way more options for reasonably priced red dots that are also very durable and hold a zero through all kinds of abuse. So I'm pretty happy to see that. And so my thought on the market wasn't totally crazy. I did get mocked for that at the time because I bought a cheap one and then it didn't fit on my gun. So yeah, you live and learn. And sometimes clearly it is better to just spend more for the higher quality thing. I'm sure the expensive optics from 3 or 4 years ago are still going fine. Whereas the cheap optics from 3 or 4 years ago, probably all done by now. But these newer ones, I mean, the market seems to have matured and it seems like you can actually get a really solid red dot that's in line with a lot of what HoloPoint sells, which HoloPoint, I believe their optics are made in China as well, but people can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. Most of these brands, I think, are made in China. And so, yeah, you can buy a China, and a lot of them tend to be copycats of each other, copycat designs. You see that in a lot of industries, obviously. But so either way, I'm gonna try one. I was thinking of doing Hollow Sun. I think I'm gonna try Sealy is the brand that seems to have a lot of pretty good reviews out there on durability and has all the features that you'd expect from the middle of the market, the $400-$500 optics. So we'll see how that goes, because I mean, it's going to be hard not to be better than this dot that came on this gun. SIG's got even nicer, has like some pretty nice offerings now, but I don't think this Zero Elite, I don't think it has a very good reputation with anyone. It's a plastic optic with a little metal shield around it on my gun. But yeah, I mean, with the battery issues and also you have to take it off to replace the battery. The dot to change the brightness is on right by the inner lens, which is super annoying and not really functional outside of working on it on a bench. But yeah, so we'll see how that goes. I'm just glad to see the market's improving, and I mean the range experience is improving. Our red dots are getting better and cheaper. I don't know, this positive trends, and right now is a pretty good time to buy again, because it's bad time for the industry because they've been declining since 2020, as we've written a lot about. And one of our stories actually this week, to transition smoothly into the news update that we're going to go through here now, is about gun sales being up. You saw a year-over-year increase in November, but they're still pretty far down from where they were in 2020 or 2021, right? So there are still good deals on the market for anybody who's looking right now. You can find, I think my friend's buying a gift of a Shield Plus, and I think it's like $375 on Bud's Guns right now. So,
nice.
You can find good deals for guns right now, which is great for consumers. But of course, the market is, as I just mentioned, ticking back up again. So I don't know how much longer that's going to last.
I was going to say, could see the price increases. I'm hearing rumors from folks that are plugged in saying they're expecting price increases starting next year. So get in while you can.
Yeah, right now, good time to buy. That might go away, so especially because 2024 is an election year, which is when you tend to see an upswing in gun sales anyway. But so what else do we got, though, news-wise?
Yeah, so heading to the links in the newsletter. The first one is some not so good news, comes to us from the New York Times reporting on some CDC data that unfortunately shows that the firearm suicide rate as of 2022 reached its record level since the CDC has been tracking specifically the firearm suicide rate. And they note that since 2019 specifically, so between 2019 and 2022, it increased 10%. So not great, not a great trend, certainly, that it's going that direction. They did note, so one caveat is just that suicides overall have been trending upwards. So they said over the last 2 decades, it's been about a 33% increase in suicides overall. So not great, but they did note that over half of those suicides involve firearms. So some not so great trends that we're seeing there in the data.
Yeah, certainly. Significant issue for the gun owning community. And has been for a long time, right? I mean, this is the way a lot of people take their lives, and it's something that we have seen more efforts in recent years to try and alleviate and to try to approach this from a way that's going to be encouraging to people who own guns and are struggling, rather than alienating or pushing them away from seeking help. Because that is one of the difficulties of it. Because you don't want somebody who is actively having suicidal thoughts to have a firearm, but also you don't want the threat of taking their firearm away to dissuade them from seeking help. So it's a really difficult issue for sure. And one where obviously we need to focus more research and thought and effort into. So I've lost friends to suicide, and a very close friend. So it's terrible experience, and something that, we've talked about on the show before. There are groups out there like Walk the Talk, and a number of other firearms community led efforts, but yeah, clearly a lot of work left to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And then sort of on a related note, related to mental health and firearms, The Trace is our other Newslink story we're going to talk about today. They did a great report on just sort of how state law interacts with the federal prohibition on folks that have been involuntarily committed. So basically they went and looked at what are each individual state's policies regarding do temporary, mental health holds, does that disqualify them? And what they found is in the vast majority of states, it pretty much just mirrors federal law, where you need a court-ordered involuntary commitment for a prohibition to kick in, which is obviously pretty relevant considering the tragedy we saw in Lewiston.
Yeah. The takeaway from that story to me was that it's very complicated as to whether or not somebody who's been involuntarily committed actually becomes prohibited from owning guns. That's supposed to be something that's a base level part of federal law, but the practice of it is much more difficult than I think most people realize. So that piece is really good. Obviously I understand that the Trace, they take funding from every town, and they have a clear editorial point of view, which I understand why that puts off some people, but I do think that they still produce really good reporting, even keeping that in mind. Just because somebody has a different point of view from you doesn't mean that they're always lying about everything. You know what I mean? And Jennifer Massia, who's one of the writers for this piece, is also a commentator at CNN, and so I've had positive interactions with her. We'd probably have to have her on the show at some point, because I do think this topic is really important. I've talked to a mental health professional who was in charge of deciding whether or not somebody gets involuntarily committed in Pennsylvania. Is actually one of the members and of the Reload. And yeah, I mean, it's not easy. And a lot of, as they talk about in the piece, oftentimes somebody who's being committed is given a choice as to whether they want to accept a voluntary commitment instead of an involuntary commitment. And that can have significant consequences, obviously, for whether or not they can own guns after that point. And of course, the priority for most mental health professionals is in trying to help these people come through their crisis instead of focusing on their access to firearms down the line. So it's another one of these things that we wish was really easy to figure out, but in real life is pretty hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on to some of the stories we wrote this week. We had a pretty big court case that actually came down last week, but we wrote about it and it's in the newsletter. A federal judge struck down the federal prohibition on 18 to 20-year-olds purchasing handguns. So that's
purchasing them from licensed dealers.
From dealers. From FFLs.
It's a very specific law because it's not a ban on 18 to 20-year-olds owning handguns or even buying handguns. It's on buying them from licensed dealers. So in some ways, it's it's a kind of odd law because if you're 18 to 20-year-old in the United States and you live in a place where they don't have universal background check requirements, and even places where they do, this is actually an issue in Virginia. There's a court case here over this fact because universal background check states they require you to go and transfer your gun through a licensed dealer, right, for when you're making a sale. And if you are 18 to 20 and you try to do that with a handgun, NICS won't let you process that check. So you just effectively are barred from owning handguns outside of receiving gifts, from your parents or family members. And so that becomes a more significant legal challenge under the Constitution. But then if you in a state where you don't have that, you can just buy guns through private sales, which kind of defeats the whole concept of why this needs to happen, because then you're buying one without a background check, which goes against the argument that more people should have to get background checks. So, but regardless, that didn't have anything to do with the ruling. The ruling was pretty straightforward, Bruin analysis that said these sorts of restrictions didn't exist at the founding, right? And therefore this law can't stand. In fact, I believe they talked about how at the founding, if you were 18, you were basically required to own firearms because you had to muster for the militia, and people who were in the militia had to bring their own firearms in many cases, and it was required by law. So it's sort of the exact opposite tradition, I suppose, at least during the founding era, than what this law stands out. So interestingly, what is a nationwide effect, and it didn't have a stay attached to it. So, but also extremely likely to be appealed.
I was gonna say it has since been stayed. I saw an update, I think yesterday. So the government announced they're appealing it, and the judge said, "Okay, well, we'll stay it pending the appeal." So, but there was, like as you said, when it was issued, it was interesting. There was no stay put on the implications of the ruling.
Yeah, I don't think it ever had any actual effect. I don't think NICS was ever processing 18 to 20-year-old handgun purchases by licensed dealers, or through licensed dealers. So, but yeah, that's exactly what I expected to happen. That it would be stayed upon appeal. And so, if you're 18, 20 years old, and you want to buy a handgun, that's positive news for you, but it's not something that's going to affect you immediately. That's unless you're a plaintiff in the case, perhaps. But yeah. So I always want to cause I know people it's hard to understand how these things work sometimes. And so I always want to be clear, about the actual practical effect today. And that is not going to be changing how things operate at this moment, but it very well could relatively soon down the line, depending on how fast this case moves.
Certainly. Speaking of legal cases, another story that we covered this week was a coalition of gun rights groups led by the California Rifle and Pistol Association are taking Los Angeles County, the city of Laverne, and California Attorney General Rob Bonta to court over all sorts of complaints about carry permit issuance. So LA County, for example, the suit alleges has been routinely engaging in a practice of taking 15, 16, 17 months to process people's carry permit applications, which obviously, is a delay in some people's eyes, an excessive delay. And then the city of Laverne, we've reported on previously, kind of made headlines because once they finally had to create a carry permit process, they said, well, you have to pay $1,000 or more to get your permit, which is another one of those things where you're putting financial burdens in the way of folks being able to exercise their right to carry. And then finally, they're going after the attorney general because California is one of two states in the entire country. Hawaii is the other one that both doesn't recognize a single other state's permit and refuses to issue under any circumstances a permit to non-residents. So it effectively completely denies the right to carry to non-residents. So all three are coming under legal scrutiny in this case.
Yeah, I think this case is noteworthy mainly because it's probably the closest case we've seen to the core holdings in Bruin itself.
Yeah,
because that's what Bruin was about, gun carry permitting, right? And the court struck down the May issue law that California and a number of other states had, and it's said that shall issue permitting is okay, where as long as you go through the process, they have to give you a permit. But one thing you'll notice, and we've talked a lot about this concurrence, right, in other aspects, and that's sort of some of the takeaways from the Roberts and Kavanaugh concurrence, where they talked about shall issue permitting being, constitutionally okay. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but being okay for, in theory, except if the fees are too exorbitant or the process is too onerous, right? That's basically what they said. And so now we have a case that's actually dealing with exactly that issue. And so it's probably one of the strongest post-Bruin cases that I've seen come out, just because it so straightforwardly goes to the heart of what Bruin actually dealt with, the facts of that case. And so I would say they have a pretty good chance of winning at this point. But it also, I will at the same time, it does get into sort of the weeds of this stuff, right? And it's like how far a court's going to want to go. I'm sure this is kind of an outlier case, I would imagine, for $1,000 fee. It's going to be really hard for a government to justify why they need $1,000 to process a background check or a concealed carry application. That probably isn't going to hold up in court. But what exactly are exorbitant fees? Where's that line? What is too onerous of a process? Where does that line fall? What kind of training can be required? This would be another obvious question. How many hours of training can you require? Can you require people to go outside? For instance, Washington, D.C., you have to leave Washington, D.C. to actually complete the training that's required because they don't have any public ranges available in the city. And it requires a live fire aspect to your training to get the permit. So it's, there's a lot of those kinds of questions that I think are going to come up down the line. And this is probably going to be the first one. And it'll be interesting to see what the court says, or if they even go that detailed, if they try to micromanage things to that extent, or if they're just going to say, this isn't acceptable, we've got to come up with something else.
Right.
We'll see.
That's a good point. That's something definitely worth keeping an eye on. And then the final thing we want to talk about today is sort of an odd political maneuver on behalf of Senate Democrat Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, moving to bring an assault weapon ban bill to the floor. Sort of a bizarre way. He didn't actually call for a roll call vote. You kind of covered this whole saga, and you tell us what happened there.
Yeah, it's not necessarily bizarre. It's more like in a way that wasn't designed to actually pass, right? Like Chuck Schumer knew this bill wasn't going to pass. And I think he knew that this bill probably couldn't even get 50 votes. One of the weird things about it, and we've written quite a bit about this over at The Reload. So if people want to go a little more in depth here, they should check out the members piece that I wrote on Friday, or any of the pieces that we've written about this the last week or so. Because if you remember, the week before, there was a new rebranding effort for the assault weapons ban that was introduced by, Senator Angus King from Maine and 3 moderate Democrats, or at least more moderate Democrats, people who hadn't officially co-sponsored an assault weapons ban before. And so they brought out this new bill, the Go Safe Act, the gas-operated semi-automatic firearms. What does the E in Go Safe stand for?
Exclusion.
Exclusion. It is exclusion. Okay. Yeah. Gives you kind of Chinese exclusion. Putting exclusion in legislation names
doesn't have a good history.
Yeah. Not sure why they did that. Anyway, I think they just wanted the acronym, the Go Safe thing. But regardless, Yeah, it's basically a rebranded bill. You took a deep dive into it for members, exactly what it does and why it's it's not very well written. I guess you could just put it at that. But there was some momentum from that, I guess, political momentum, because you got 3 people who'd never sponsored an assault weapons ban before, and now they're on this new, basically just a rebranding of assault weapons ban. It's actually a little bit stricter in a number of ways too, but regardless, okay, well, maybe that's what they're doing. They're just going to take this momentum from this, announcement of this new bill, and they're going to push forward with that. And maybe they can get to 50 votes because there's 45 people are sponsoring the Feinstein introduced assault weapons ban that's been introduced like every year for the last 30 years and never gets more than 40, mid 40s, and they're all Democrats. But so maybe you get to, 48 that way. And that's closer to 50. It's not clear that you can get to 50 even with that new bill. In fact, it seems like you can't. But they didn't even go that route. He just brought up the actual regular assault weapons ban, which still didn't have those other 3 Democrats co-sponsoring it. So it only has 45 co-sponsors. There are 45 total sponsors, which means it doesn't have majority support. None of the other Democrats who haven't joined on came out to say they would vote for that bill. In fact, the only person, and none of the Republicans either, none of your moderate Republicans or any of the Republicans who were on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act from last year, that gun control bill, obviously very different from an assault weapons ban in severity, but none of them came out in support. And the only person who responded to our requests for comment on how they would vote on this was Senator Tester, John Tester, Democrat from Montana. He's up for re-election this year in a state that voted, I think, 57% for Donald Trump in 2020. So fairly tough re-election campaign for a Democrat, I think. And he came out and said he wouldn't support an assault weapons ban. So that was the main insight we gained from all this, because the vote failed because it was a unanimous consent vote. That's the other aspect to it. I think he knew it wasn't going to even get 50 votes, which would be politically embarrassing. And so instead of putting it up for a roll call vote or going through the normal legislative process on a bill like this, he asked for unanimous consent. And unanimous consent, as the name implies, requires you to have everybody on board in the Senate to basically suspend normal rules and pass a bill that way, just by everyone agreeing to it, nobody objecting. And so it just required one person to object to derail that whole effort, which obviously he knew was exactly what would happen and exactly what did happen. And so it wasn't even a real attempt to try and pass things or get people on the record as to where they stood, because unless they wanted to be on record, they didn't have to, right? So Tester wanted to be on record. That's why he came out and said something. He didn't have to. Cinema, for instance, didn't say anything. You didn't have Collins say anything. You didn't have Murkowski or Romney say anything about this bill. None of them came down and spoke in opposition or support to it. So it was a way to let people say something about the bill if they wanted to, and not say anything about it if they didn't want to. Right. And a way of saying, I brought it to the floor. Right. When, technically he brought it to the floor, but not in a serious way.
Yeah, no, it's pretty clear, just as you laid out there, that all of this was for the political messaging purposes instead of actually trying to get legislation through. It's pretty transparent what was being done there.
Yeah, it's still fairly interesting because they didn't do this after the House passed the assault weapons ban last year when Democrats controlled the House.
Right.
And so I don't why Chuck Schumer felt this was the time to do it, or it needed to happen at this point. I don't really know. And why he went about it this way instead of at least if he'd done Go Safe, it would be well, this is a new, we're creating this new unity coalition of Democrats who some of them haven't sponsored this type of legislation before. Although I will note all of those Democrats on that bill on the Go Safe bill have supported an assault weapons ban. So they've publicly come out in support of one before. So they weren't really the guys to watch. When really the people to watch are Tester, Manchin, Sinema, Collins, Romney, Murkowski, those people. And then maybe you get to the Rubios or people like that, some of the folks who voted for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, but haven't generally supported gun bans. They would be the people to watch, not King or Heinrich or some of the other people who were, or Kelly, Mark Kelly in Arizona, or Bennett, who they were all on the Go Safe Act. These just aren't the guys who are signaling that there's actual movement on the issue. The people who would be signaling that would be all the other ones that I just mentioned. And none of them, except for Tester, said anything. And Tester said no. So if anything, we know that there's less support, perhaps, than was possible before this vote happened. Or non-vote. I don't even want to call it. Vote isn't even the right word for it.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, that's all we've got for this week. If you guys like what we do here at The Reload, you should head over to the reload.com and consider buying a membership today. That is how we fund our reporting. It's how we fund this whole operation. We do not take funding from anyone else but our members in the form of membership dues. So that is how we survive. We literally could not do it without our members. And of course, if you buy a membership, you will get exclusive access to all these pieces we just talked about. There's a lot more information in there on the website or in your Sunday newsletter that members get that nobody else gets. So head over, check out the options today, pick up a membership. It really supports what we're doing, helps us out. And of course, if you're not able to do that, you can sign up for our free newsletter, which goes out once a week, doesn't crowd your inbox, and gives you the latest of what's going on with guns in America. You can also, of course, share this episode with somebody you think might be interested in it. That helps us grow as well. You could leave a rating on the podcast app that you're listening to it on, or give it a thumbs up on YouTube, wherever you happen to be. All that stuff helps. But that's it for this week. We will see you guys again real soon.